Hi, welcome to The Pursuit of Truth. So this should be no surprise to anyone with any common sense. The news stories on Sky News about the COVID-19 bereaved families court case against the government that's found in their favour, that the government acted illegally when they put people from hospitals with asymptomatic or even with COVID or without testing them into care homes and causing the deaths of the people that were meant to be protected who were already vulnerable. Of course, the government will deny it, and this court case is like they always do. They always pin it on organisations rather than individuals so that no one takes the blame. It's easy to blame an organisation. So here's two bits from the news that you can listen to. Just hear that these are the people that we trust with our lives. We trust this system, and it fails us every single time. And they try and tell us, oh, don't look at this, don't use your common sense, wait for scientists, wait for research. We'll learn from these mistakes. But I recorded these podcasts back in 2020, knowing that this was wrong and going to lead to this. Everyone with any common sense, you don't have to go to Oxford or Cambridge or Eton or whatever to have common sense. That's the whole point of it. And we all knew that if you've got vulnerable people, no matter what, you keep the sick people in hospital until they're okay to go home or into care home and separate them.
A very good morning to you. We start with the breaking news. A landmark decision by the High Court that the government acted unlawfully at the beginning of the COVID pandemic when it discharged patients from hospitals to care homes. Judges have ruled that the government's policies failed to take into account the risk to elderly and vulnerable residents from non-symptomatic transmission of COVID. The case was brought by two women whose fathers died from COVID-19 and says the government failed to protect them and others like them. Let's get to Sky's Ashish Joshi, who's at the High Court for us. And Ashish, sum it up, this ruling that I know just broke moments ago, and I believe you're also joined by one of those two people who sadly lost their fathers.
Yes, we're going to speak to Dr. Kathy Gardner in just a second. Just to give you some context to our viewers who are just joining us, this is a landmark ruling. This is the first time that this government has been held to account for its scandalous treatment of care home residents during the pandemic. Remember, we were told repeatedly that the government had acted in the best interests of elderly and vulnerable and disabled care home residents who were left exposed to a killer virus which was imported into their care homes because of the government's policy to discharge patients, asymptomatic patients who were potentially carrying this virus into these care homes. And the government said it acted at the time because it didn't want to overwhelm the NHS. It was trying to free up beds. And what it was doing was it was protecting the NHS and care home residents as well. But we know now, almost 2 years afterwards, that 20,000 elderly and vulnerable residents in those care homes did lose their lives. And this has come to be regarded as one of the biggest scandals in this pandemic. And now the High Court has ruled that the government acted unlawfully. Let's speak now to Dr. Kathy Gardner, who lost her father, Michael, at the peak of the pandemic, spring 2020. I'm very sorry for your loss. Thousands of families will have a sense of justice and a sense of relief. Tell me how you're feeling right now, Dr. Gardner.
Oh, huge relief. We knew at the time that something had gone so badly wrong. I've known all along that what the government did was wrong, and today it's that vindication that we were right, and I'm so pleased that's been proven.
Yeah. What sort of messages of support have you had throughout this case and bringing it to the High Court? You were forced to do that because you wanted the government to be held accountable. Do you feel now that they are being held to account and that this will change the course of future pandemics and possibly open the doors to thousands of compensation claims as well?
There's quite a lot of questions there. I've had fantastic support from so many bereaved families in a similar situation to mine, and that support has been invaluable. And indeed, I wouldn't be here today had it not been for the crowdfunding that so many thousands of people supported. I'm so grateful for that. And this is the vindication that we were right all along. I was right to bring the case. I was so determined to try and hold the government to account. This was such a huge failing. And I was insulted every time they said, oh, we did everything we could and it was unprecedented. And no, you didn't do everything you could. And no, it wasn't unprecedented. And one of my main aims was to make sure this never happens again. That if we're ever in this situation again, that the government will have to make sure that they take everything they should into account, to make sure they do whatever they can to protect the most vulnerable people in society.
When you were at home, I imagine you weren't allowed to attend your father's funeral, but when you were there, you were mourning for your father, and you heard the government responses time and time again that they've thrown a shield around care homes to protect elderly and vulnerable residents. How did that make you feel?
I was disgusted. I've been disgusted by the constant denial that anything was done wrong, the constant claims that they handled the pandemic so well. You know, we've had a massive death toll in this country. The death toll in care homes at the start was unbelievable. I think somewhere near half the deaths in the first few months were care home residents, the very group of people that should have been the most protected by that. And of course, grieving during the height of the pandemic, when we were in lockdown, was very difficult. I couldn't be with my father when he died. I couldn't hold his hand. All those things that you think will be what you would normally expect to do when you're losing a parent. There were 3 of us at his funeral. Myself, my husband and my mother. That was all. No other family and friends at all. But all the families that have gone through this have really been traumatized by losses during the pandemic. And when you have a deep belief that the government itself has let you down, that they've taken steps that they absolutely shouldn't have taken, that's made it even more painful. And the constant denial and the constant saying we did so well just is insulting.
We haven't had a government response to the judgment yet. Did you ever believe that the government had acted in the interests of the country because it was dealing with an unprecedented health crisis? Was there a part of you, before Michael died, that you believed that the government was trying to do its best, if not actually doing its best? Was it actually trying to do its best, do you think?
I didn't have a sense of that at the beginning. I think you have to remember, my father died on the 3rd of April 2020. He got ill in March. So very, very early on in the pandemic that we were aware of it. I think I hoped the government would do a good job. We used to have a very, very good public health system in this country. I thought at the time, in the early months of 2020, surely we won't suffer as badly as Italy was suffering in those early days, if we remember that. But when I realised that my father had COVID, or apparently had COVID, he was never tested, I couldn't believe it. And then when I heard about the hospital discharge policy and I looked it up and I read it, I couldn't believe it. That there was no mention anywhere of how care home residents should be protected. So myself and my neighbours were all sheltering at home, keeping ourselves safe. My father was in just a larger home. Exposed, completely exposed.
What do you want to see happen next? We haven't had a government response. This will set a future for further health emergencies in the future. And this is the first time the government has been held accountable pre-inquiry, before any inquiry. What would you like to see happen next?
Well, I have asked for an apology from Matt Hancock, who was Secretary of State at the time. Although to me, an apology is, it's all very well, but actually I think he also should consider his position as an MP. He's still an MP. He stood up in Parliament and said to MPs that he'd tried to put a protective ring around care homes. I knew that was a lie when it was said first of all in spring 2020. And it's definitely a lie, and I think he should consider that. The Prime Minister absolutely should go, but I don't believe he has any conscience or moral fibre that says that he should take any responsibility for this. But as far as I'm concerned, he absolutely does. This was under his watch.
I think Matt Hancock's actually doing the rounds, the interviews this week, defending the government's handling of the crisis. Thank you very much. Good luck with
And then there's this guy. And the funny thing is the vulnerable people are the ones that are dying now, whilst the media and the politicians aren't talking about COVID anymore, and everyone's getting back to normal for economic reasons, whilst those vulnerable people are dying.
That the government acted unlawfully by allowing hospitals to discharge patients into care homes during the COVID pandemic. I'm joined now by David Crabtree, the owner of 2 care homes in West Yorkshire, which had 12 coronavirus deaths in 8 weeks at the beginning of the pandemic. And thanks so much for joining me. David, talk us through, if you may, sadly relive the moment, those first few COVID deaths that you had in your homes, and exactly how that played out, where those patients had come from.
Yeah, today's judgment has just allowed the resurfacing of the complete anger I feel about this. On the 28th of March 2020, the government, along with the hospitals, the PHE, Public Health England, the CQC, produced a document that said they were to discharge patients back to care homes. These were residents who were actually in care homes as a result of some sort of medical problem. But they were hurriedly discharged, and we demanded that they be tested prior to discharge. That was refused because they were not symptomatic on the day of discharge on the 28th of March. This was, in our case, initially 2 residents who were on the medical wards were discharged without testing. They subsequently, 3 days later, developed symptoms. We asked for readmission to hospital. We were denied because they were not admitting back from care homes. This didn't just put the whole of our resident population at risk. This put in the vast percentage of staff at risk. Most care homes in Britain are not nursing homes. Therefore, the amount of PPE they would carry would be minimal. We were then in a situation where we had live COVID within the building, and our carers could not access testing. We could not test the residents. The residents, those 2 residents that came directly from hospital, subsequently died, and we had an outbreak then of a further 6 deaths.
And so, David, just again, I mean, the key point in light of today's ruling is your attempts there during that terrible time to push back on receiving more patients like this, or not being able to return the positive patients to the hospitals. So who did you have those discussions with, and what position did you feel they were in having to turn down your requests?
We phoned the GPs. The GPs were instructed not to readmit. The ambulance service put a doctor in charge of triage to assess who could go via ambulance. We were denied at every point to return patients who had become symptomatic to hospital. Those patients died as a result. We were given no help, no support whatsoever. Social services, social care was left to be thrown under the bus. Mr. Hancock, his ring of protection, left us without a prayer. The people died unnecessarily. Further, as is the case today in the High Court, the cases were people who were already in care homes, who were not suspect or were not subject to any contagion from COVID, were now exposed to it directly as a result of the government telling hospitals they had to discharge back to care homes.
And I guess, I mean, from your views here, which are very clear, David, you probably have felt that the government was responsible for some of these issues beforehand. But does today's ruling strengthen your view?
It vindicates everything we've said. It's just common sense. You don't need to be a medic to know that you do not put in live viruses into areas where there are no viruses. We've known this for centuries. We don't do it. Why would the government? Well, the government panicked. They said the NHS will be under threat and people will die in hospitals. What that says, to be honest, is we don't care about the social care staff nor the elderly residents that were subjected to live COVID being discharged without being tested. It was only weeks afterward where you could start to get testing. If somebody went into A&E and they were there for several hours, they would not test prior to coming back to care homes. So even if they weren't admitted to hospital, they were bringing the virus back in. Ambulance crews were returning patients without PPE on. It was a complete and utter mess, all for Mr. Hancock to save his face in front of the NHS. And there was, definitely was, no ring of protection.
I guess, David, I think you said 28th of March 2020 was the first COVID death you had in one of your homes. Clearly, that was right at the beginning of the pandemic. And at that point, clearly, there was a lot of unknowns. And as you already pointed to, there wasn't capacity for things like testing yet, or not sufficient capacity. And the government was in a difficult position. No doubt this was not an easy thing to handle. Do you have some sympathy for those difficulties that they were in? If they were to come out today and heed this High Court ruling and start to acknowledge the things that went wrong, would you have some level of sympathy for the very difficult position that they were in?
Absolutely not. We witnessed, and Sky reported, the deaths throughout care homes in Italy and France and Spain throughout February and March. And yet, knowing how contagious this was, they made a deliberate choice to discharge elderly residents back, which, again, I re-emphasize, this wasn't just about risking the lives of the elderly, this was risking our staff, our dedicated, low-paid staff who were turning in at 7 a.m. every morning, not knowing whether they were going to catch COVID and return to their children.
David, thanks so much for joining us at short notice on this.
So there you go. There's two views of about this. Obviously, that was in the morning. Since then, a spokesperson for Matt Hancock has come back saying that on behalf of him, that the High Court said that ministers didn't break any rules. It was just PHE, Public Health England, which has already been disbanded and renamed, I believe, because I suspect they already knew this was going to happen. But it is questionable why, and Boris Johnson has said he's going to investigate this. It's always clever how they always blame organisations, not individuals, but it's interesting how, you know, he's talking about Italy and France, and here in England, I don't know about America, how all these elderly people in care homes, vulnerable people, were the ones that were affected the most from this, obviously because of their age and vulnerability. But obviously they knew that there was an issue with contagion, because that's why they stopped relatives coming to visit their elderly parents. But then they were letting other people who they didn't know whether they had COVID or not into a new environment. Even if there wasn't testing, which I know Matt Hancock is going to fall back on, saying, well, if there wasn't testing so we couldn't do anything. The thing is, you don't take the risk. If you know there's some risk, that's why they didn't let relatives come and see their people, because they knew there was some risk that they may bring it in and end up killing their relatives. But instead, the government just allowed people from hospitals, which, remember, hospitals were divided up into COVID and non-COVID areas. So they could have easily stayed there. But I guess they're going to say capacity. But remember, they built that to try and mimic China, where they didn't build it, did they? They took a building and put beds in it and walls, and then they never used it. They could have transported everyone there. All these hubs they had around the country, they could have been the place where they transported them, so they stayed within COVID people and didn't spread this thing. But now, of course, the same thing, that kind of mentality of not actually protecting the vulnerable people, is what's happening now by the media and politicians not talking about the 200 deaths every single day. They talk about the deaths of Ukrainians, but they won't talk about the war that's happening here, of 200 people dying every single day, and is not even mentioned. They're talking about China, and the 100, in a week, 100 people have died of COVID in some city there, but not in the UK. Because at the end of the day, it looks like they don't really want to protect the vulnerable people. And it draws me back to that Bill Gates thing about reducing population. I mean, I know that's, I don't know whether that's a connection or not, but it's funny how that it's happened, and those vulnerable people are now the ones that have paid the price for this, no matter how many lockdowns, if you don't actually do it properly. And now everyone's spreading it around. Take care, take it easy, God bless, and peace.